Who's on my committee? There. Planning and Development Committee on August 16th. Ms. Andrews? Here. Councilor Walton?
Here.
Councilor Wolverton?
Wolverton.
Councilor Sands? Here. Councilor Nance? Here. All present.
Thank you, Ms. Salter. I'll start with a motion to dispense the reading and approval of the minutes.
So moved.
Motion from Councilor Guani, second from Councilor Sins. All those in favor?
Wherever you want to sit.
Any opposed? That passes 5-0. Okay, we are gonna go a little bit out of order. Wait, that was something that was
Here's the sign sheet.
okay, thank you. We got a pen as well. Okay. All right. Quiet, everybody. All right, I'm gonna bounce around a little bit out of order. We've got several items tonight. We have two very big items, so there's gonna be time limits on our discussions, so we can move on both of these tonight. Yes. Oh.
He's here too for the annexation.
We're gonna take you first. So, well, let me just get rid of 160115 update on past, present, future sidewalk projects. Greg Cobb, BEZ department. Mr. Smith, anything tonight? No updates. Nice. We're gonna continue to carry that over without objection. Okay, we're gonna jump to 040721. Request to consider annexation into the city of Homewood from unincorporated Jefferson County for 1629 Sunset Drive, Abdullah Azam. Yeah. Okay, so Ms. Salter, are you the one that's?
Yes, well, yes, sir. Me and her, I gave you some erroneous information first, and I talked to the petitioner, but he had two pieces of property. One, he already had annexed into Homewood, which is his residence, and then he built another house on the adjacent property that he's now moved into, and his son's, that he's asking to be annexed in now, and his son is gonna purchase the house he lives in now.
Yes.
Okay, and that's the house we want to annex it into Homewood, is that right?
Yes,
The one-
1629, which
Okay.
is the one in your hand right there.
Okay, this one here.
This is the old one.
Okay. and
That's
this-
the new one.
This is the new one here.
Yes.
Okay,
Okay. we'll sign now.
okay. Thank you.
But the one that you built, that you're living in now, is the one
Yes.
you want to be annexed in. The older one, the older home that his son's wanting to buy from him has already been annexed.
Okay, I got you.
And it
Okay,
was just a vacant lot that he didn't ask to be annexed in at the time he was asking for his residence, but now he's built a new house, which they moved into. They're asking to be annexed in.
and you're surrounded by Homewood, correct?
Yes.
Yes, okay, great. Okay. All right, are there any questions? Any questions from the committee or other council members?
Mr. Kenny, was that legal description okay?
Okay, if there are no other questions, then can I have a motion?
Second.
You're approving, motion to
Yes.
approve? Okay, I have a motion from Counselor Nellens and second from Counselor Gwaltney. All those in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Okay, that passes 5-0 from the committee, and we will also vote on that next week at the city council for the full council hearing.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Next week, and I'll just take you down to the federal office. It won't be till next week before, but.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're gonna jump to 130721. All right, 130721, public hearing set for August 23rd, 2021 at 6 for consideration to adopt new zoning districts for the Homewood Downtown District, amending the city's zoning ordinance to add Article 8 entitled Downtown District to Appendix A zoning of Homewood's Code of Ordinances. Planning Commission had a vote of 5-3-1 for a favorable recommendation. This comes to us from President Wyatt and the Planning Commission. We're going to start from a presentation from the Regional Planning Commission's Lindsay Puckett, who's been involved with this project for 4 years now. And then we have our consultant from Placemakers, Susan Henderson, is on Zoom, and so she will be in attendance next Monday night for the public hearing, but we do have her tonight on Zoom. So with that, take it away.
I'll take over. All right, thank you, Jennifer, for having us. Again, my name is Lindsay Puckett. I'm the principal planner at the Regional Planning Commission of Greater Birmingham. We are not currently under contract for this project, but I'm here tonight to talk about the project because it did start with as a contract with the Regional Planning Commission and the City of Homewood in December of 2016, when we had actually been in negotiations probably over a year talking to the Planning Commission and the council to create the scope of work. So it actually goes back to 2015.
6 years.
So 6 years. So but anyway, all right, so Brian, if you'll advance the next slide. So the scope of work and the contract was twofold. The first was to develop a downtown Homewood master plan, and then to draft a new zoning code for the downtown area in order to implement recommendations from the master plan and consolidate the 13 zoning districts and various sign districts. At its core, a master plan is a vision of what a community wants to become and a framework for accomplishing that vision by providing policy recommendations to guide growth, future growth, and development. In the state of Alabama, a master plan is advisory in nature and does not have the force of law. Hence, it is not legally binding. But to establish a new set of zoning regulations for downtown Homewood, the master plan was needed to provide the legal basis for those regulations in order to adhere to Alabama Code of Law, Section 1152-72, which states that zoning regulations shall be made in accordance with the master plan. Previous to that, the city only had a citywide comprehensive plan, which was last developed by KPS and adopted in 2007. So this is kind of what we would call a sub-area plan, or, to that, which actually trumps a citywide plan. The proposed new downtown zoning code would provide the regulatory tools necessary to implement the policy stated in the downtown plan. In September 2017, the process for the development of the downtown master plan commenced, and I was the project manager for the plan, working with my community planning team from the Regional Planning Commission of Greater Birmingham. We sought to engage with city staff, city councilors, the Downtown Homewood Merchants Association, and the general public. The public involvement process was an interactive process that involved both online and face-to-face public involvement methods. There were 1,486 respondents to 3 surveys, which included a visioning survey and 2 visual preference surveys. Approximately 250 written comments that were submitted from 133 people at the 2 rounds of public open houses, and 225 people that submitted comments via online mapping activity. The public involvement process for the master plan helped to inform the development of a future vision for downtown Homewood. The vision in the document states that the people of Homewood envision a pedestrian-friendly downtown, which includes mixed-use development at a range of scales and that respects the surrounding residential neighborhoods and the 18th Street commercial core. The vision reinforces the existing retail core areas and public spaces by organizing new mixed-use development and streetscape amenities around those areas. Chapter 5 of the master plan outlines policy-based recommendations that are arranged around 9 topics, including future land use and zoning. The opening paragraph of the chapter notes that one of the roles of the public sector is to put into place policies that guide development and inform design and capital investment decisions. A future land use map is the policy basis to guide zoning decisions under state law. And the future land use map shown in the heart of Homewood Master Plan was the result of that public visioning process. The future land use map has 7 land use categories, 3 of which are mixed use categories that are intended to respect the surrounding residential neighborhoods by stair-stepping or decreasing new mixed use development density and intensity away from the core. Next slide. As stated on page 82 of the master plan, the future land use map is not a zoning map, and the land use categories indicated on the map must not be interpreted as zoning districts. Whereas the land use categories in the future land use map recommend a range of potentially appropriate land uses and intensities, the districts on a zoning map establish detailed requirements for setbacks, height, use, parking, and other characteristics. I say this because I like for you to note that the future land use descriptions for mixed use low, mixed use medium, and mixed use high are intended to set the policy to distribute a range of step down land use densities and intensities in the different areas of downtown Homewood. But those future land use descriptions did not prescribe, say, the number of stories that should be capped in each area. That's because that's left to the negotiation process of determining height limits and other regulations such as setback requirements and parking requirements, those are all regulatory in nature and have to be part of the development of the new zoning code, not part of the master plan itself. Next. Chapter 5 of the master plan also includes recommendations regarding the current zoning code, suggesting the following changes to the zoning code as it pertains to downtown Homewood. Allow live-work units. Replace the existing 13 zoning designations in downtown Homewood with new mixed-use districts in order to provide for a range of densities and intensities that will align with the 3 mixed-use categories shown on the future land use map, and create a new sign ordinance for the downtown area. So after a 13-month process, the master plan was vetted before the City Council Planning Development Committee here and was adopted by the Homewood Planning Commission October 2nd, 2018. There were 2 absent that night, so it was adopted by a unanimous 7-0 vote by the Planning Commission, which included the following members that were present that night to vote. Jeff Foster, who made the first motion to approve it. Mr. John Contreras, who seconded the motion. Battalion Chief Hill, James Riddle, former Councilman Britt Thames, Mark Woods, and Billy Higginbotham, who was the Planning Commission Chair at the time. Next slide. Knowing that the development of a new downtown zoning district would certainly undergo scrutiny, maybe I can hear some laughter, would involve the legal rights to property owners. It would need to be legally defensible so that the city of Homewood would not have a code that was considered arbitrary and capricious. I hired the nationally respected planning and zoning firm of Placemakers to be our subconsultant and to lead the code writing process. Susan Henderson and her colleagues at Placemakers have written over 50 codes in North America. So next slide. The process to develop the downtown district code began 33 months ago in November of 2018. By January of 2019, Placemakers released their recommendations report to consider options for how the new zoning code for downtown Homewood could best be structured to implement the downtown master plan. They then met with 8 out of the 9 members of the Planning Commission in February of 2019 to discuss the annotated outline of the new zoning code. 2 rounds of public meetings were held in April and June of 2019 to obtain public comments, which coincided with the release of the first 2 drafts of the code. Work sessions were held with business owners, property owners, the Chamber of Commerce, and members of the design community, as well as listening sessions with the Planning Commission and City Council. The 3rd draft of the code was published in early August of 2019, which was followed by public hearings at the Planning Commission in November and at City Council in December of 2019. Due to public input requests, the proposed code was revised again and sent back to the Planning Commission in February of 2020. At that public hearing, the Planning Commission voted to table the proposed code. 14 months later, in April of this year, the Planning Commission voted and recommended the code to the City Council for consideration. During the month of May, Placemakers led a series of 3 public listening sessions and made further edits to the code in response to public input at those sessions. Now, after 33 months of public engagement and 6 drafts of proposed code, the City Council will consider the revised code in a public hearing next Monday on August 23rd. I appreciate you all listening, and now I'll hand the presentation over to Susan Henderson, who's on Zoom.
Thank you, Lindsay. So just to segue now into the code itself and the changes to it most recently as a result of the City Council listening sessions, the primary goal is, and really always has been, to preserve and protect downtown Homewood. And so often in many of the places we work, people have inherited zoning from the middle of the 20th century, and they really don't understand completely the amount of development entitlements that have been given and exist. And so as a result of your master planning process that Lindsay just described, one of the biggest goals of this code was to preserve and protect the character of downtown. Next slide, please. So just to continue the conversation that Lindsay began about the future land use map, we took we had to overlay that with the existing zoning map, because as you can see on the left, the darkest maroon red is what is called C4B high rise. And as a result of that entitlement existing, the zoning map had to adjust to respond to that district. And it began not doing so. We were thinking that potentially we could just do a direct translation of the future land use map. But many of the landowners in that area strongly objected to the downzoning that would result from moving from C4B to medium intensity. Next slide, please. So just tonight to remind you what the consequences of no action are. First of all, your existing zoning that is on the books today, the density bonuses that it permits makes towers possible. This building we discovered when we first started hanging out with y'all a few years ago. Most people in town are very, have many derogatory things to say about the architecture, not the use, but the architecture. And the current zoning would be 3 stories less than this. There would be no parking lots at the street. It would require clear glass at the entry, and it would pull the building up closer to the street. The consequences of no action also include 18th Street legally today could be converted into a strip center. And that really is the heart and soul of the identity of Homewood. And so that could cease to exist and become just a conventional strip center that could occur anywhere in the United States. Next slide, please. So this illustration, that map on the right shows you the extent of the C4B today. This is the property really that is poised to become high rise, depending on the parcel size. And your existing zoning calls for something called floor area ratio of 2.0. And what that means is you can have the area of the building can by right, with no questions asked, be 2 times the area of the parcel. So this illustration shows you if you completely covered your parcel, you could have a 2-story building. If you covered half the parcel, you could have a 4-story building. If you covered a quarter of the parcel, you could have an 8-story building, and so on. And next slide. Next slide, please. So this is the section of your existing code. It's called Section P, C4B high rise. And what it adds on top of that floor area ratio of 2.0 is all of these height bonuses. And so if you increase your setbacks and your step backs and you add green space and you provide outdoor decks, there's this cumulative list of height bonuses that the applicant can take advantage of. And so it's really impossible to predict exactly what could be done. The whole notion of the floor area ratio is an early 20th century zoning tool that has been determined in most instances to be unpredictable, unreliable, and many cities are actually eliminating it because residents and landowners have no idea what it can actually produce. Next slide, please. So I did some sketches, and many of you have seen this, of what is currently permitted under your zoning code. The 2 images on the left-hand corner and the upper corner of this diagram show what C4B could do. You can do 11 stories with the underground parking that would be possible based on your soil, your average soil types. You could do up to 22 stories if you had parking on an adjacent site. And at that point, I quit calculating because it just was starting to hurt my head. It was getting so high. I couldn't imagine this happening in downtown Homewood. And the interesting thing about this site, most of your downtown parcels are quite small, but this is an actual site downtown that has this amount of capacity. And then in the lower right is what is the proposed capacity under the high intensity, in which it's 5 stories max. And so that matches Soho, it matches City Hall, Aloft, and the New Valley Hotel. So it's capping it at what your recent development has capped it at. Not only that, it requires the parking behind the building, it requires street trees, and it requires a contribution to open space. Next slide, please. These illustrations were done by Louis Nacat a couple of years ago, and I want to make sure he has credit for that. Just quick sketches of what your existing zoning today would permit. And this illustration is at the corner of 18th Street and Reese Street. Looking straight ahead on the slide would be looking north on 18th. And so we are assuming that for whatever reason, let's say there's a fire in the cookie store. So it becomes a tear down on the corner. And if that's the case, by right today, you can build 3 stories and you can put a parking lot in front. So essentially, in one fell swoop with the zoning that is on the books today, you can completely detrimentally change the character of 18th Street. Next slide. Even if you chose to not do parking and utilize the fact that none of 18th Street today requires parking, and you just maximize the site, this is still the amount of mass that an applicant could do by right today. Next slide, please. And then this was Lewis's sketch for what the proposed zoning would permit. It's 2 stories with the possibility of an attic, and it is requiring it to have storefronts along the street. Your existing zoning doesn't require that. And it's requiring the parking to be in the back. Next slide, please. So in summary, as a result of the public input that we had in 2019, there were, and in early 2020, there were some major changes that were made that Lindsay already mentioned. We added parking requirements, which originally we did not have. We provided protection of reducing height and eliminating residential for 18th Street and the first block of 29th Street. We reduced heights across the board. Originally, they were suggested that it was going to go to 6 stories to be a closer match to your existing C4B. And we reduced the facade glass requirements that we originally had. And then we adjusted the setbacks because we had some people in the low intensity area that have more suburban buildings that were done in the middle of the last century. And so we were adjusting the setbacks to make sure that we didn't make them non-conforming. Next slide, please. And then this year, as a result of the council's listening sessions with you all, we made some more substantive changes. The first one was the fact that we had the regulations that applied to 18th and 29th sort of buried in the body of the text and in footnotes. And it was unclear that it just seemed like it would be very helpful if they were consolidated. And it was suggested that we add a historic overlay. So that's on section E on page 6, that we've inserted an overlay for those portions of 18th and 29th. This clarifies the 2 stories the uses. And those are substantial edits. And then a new edit was suggested by one of your council people because of the new hotel and the reactions to it, and the fact that now you have a substantial number of hotel rooms downtown, that we restrict lodging uses. And so you'll find that in table 5 and 6 of the red line code. And now the maximum in the high intensity is 50 rooms instead of the general business class hotel, which is 200 rooms. And with a 50-room hotel, at the most, you would get a boutique hotel. And finally, the restricted residential uses in high intensity. This has been a very large concern by a number of participants. And so we have added a new section, L2, which requires multifamily and high intensity to be a use on appeal. And as a result of that, you have to go through the standard development plan process, which is the public hearing process at Planning Commission. And then it requires a BZA approval in which the applicant has the burden of proving that there's no negative impact on public services, and it requires a traffic study. Next slide, please. So just to summarize, as Lindsay said, this has been a very lengthy process, and there have been 33 months of public review, 6 substantial edits, and 3 public hearings. And I just want to mention, on behalf of your city council, the Homewood City Council has been the most responsive to public input, I think, of any place that I have worked. We will frequently have 2 and possibly 3 rounds of edits as guided by council. But for the Homewood City Council to have supported and required 6 rounds of edits, I'm incredibly impressed by how well they listen to and are directed by the community. And with that, I think we are ready for questions.
Okay, Susan, thank you. Okay, what we're going to do tonight is I'd like to start with the committee and the council. So any questions for Lindsay or Susan? And then I'm going to open it up to the public. Now, next week we have a public hearing. So next week is going to be for public comment. Tonight, I would like to just focus on questions. I know there are a lot of people that are visiting us for the first time. I know, even though we feel like we've been living with this for years, that some folks are, for whatever, we're glad you're here. And I want you to ask every question you can ask for Susan and for Lindsay. So tonight, I really want to focus on questions. Next week is for comments. I do have another really big item after this one. That's the tree ordinance. And again, speaking of many, many years of things that we've been working on, the tree ordinance is also one of those things. They happen to be in my committee tonight at the same time. So I'm going to time everybody's questions as well. So let's start with the committee and or council for any questions for Susan and or Lindsay and or me or and or Alex and or Mike and or Pepper. Anybody? Go ahead, Councilor Sims.
Thank you, Council Manager. So really my question still, and I've talked to President Wyatt about this, I mean, it really goes to the map still, and I know we've covered some of this tonight with the future land use plan and the proposed map. And Brian, if you could pull up the proposed ordinance map, maybe for reference, that would be
Brian,
helpful.
pull up the last slide, please.
So, I mean, just a minute, I'll make it as brief as possible for the sake of time, but again, looking at the map in the future land use plan from the master plan.
Brian, the other direction.
That's
Thanks.
perfect. Okay.
Yeah.
So you have on the left the future land use plan in the master plan. The middle is the existing zoning, and the right is the proposed ordinance. So basically, looking at the future land use plan, everything above 28th Avenue South, you have medium density in the darker purple, and then low density in the lighter purple. And then going to the ordinance, you have above 28th Avenue South, you have high density in the darker purple and medium density in the lower purple. So in that whole block, it just appears to me that everything has been upzoned in the ordinance from the future land use plan. And I hear that part of that is because of the feedback from the property owners or others, and maybe I'm wrong, but this is what I heard in the presentation. So not so much from the master plan, but from some other process in between, decided the entitlements, because of the existing zoning, we needed to have it as medium and high instead of medium and low. And I guess my question is if we're looking at things like stair stepping away from the core and intensity, if we're looking at existing entitlements, even like along Rosedale Drive, that's C4A, which I think is up to 35 feet in height, which may be 3-story. The medium intensity is going to allow 4 stories now along Rosedale Drive. It's also going to bring the form up to the, within 8 feet front setback of Rosedale Drive. To me, it feels like a much higher intensity along that corridor than really needs to be there, especially when you not only take into account stair stepping away from the core, but also buffering and transitioning into the neighborhood north of the Rosedale. So I've talked to President White about this, and the problem with this is you can't change the map without sending it back to the Planning Commission. However, this is my primary concern with the existing plan, even though I love a lot of the narrative changes. So I guess I just want to hear from anybody who can explain it, why we need so much high intensity and medium intensity north of 28th Avenue South, in particular along Rosedale Drive and 27th Avenue South, because I think the existing land use plan makes much, or the future land use plan is much more suitable in respect to intensity and transitioning to the neighborhood.
Susan.
Susan, you want to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Counselor Sims, for that question, and it's a very good one. It is directly connected to current entitlements, and as Lindsay mentioned, the future land use map is a vision document, and so the process we had to go through to get to the zoning document was re-engaging with those landowners, because the future land use map is not entitlements. And until such time as you change your zoning, your existing zoning map today, those are the entitlements. And in the state of Alabama, downzoning is never supported by your Supreme Court. States' property rights really are the dominant finding in the Alabama Supreme Court. So as a result, even with the vision document, the current zoning entitlements are what trump. And so we would have been more inclined to leave it exactly, as I mentioned, exactly like the future land use map, if it weren't for the fact that property owners objected to it. The property owners in the area that we were suggesting the downzoning. And so for us, our professional due diligence is that to leave you with a zoning map that will result in who knows how much litigation and lost cases for the city, that really is an incredibly, it's unethical, as a planner. So that is how we wound up with the map that we have today.
From that standpoint too, so it would be unethical from the consultant's standpoint, but the master plan supports it. And since the council makes policy in charge with creating zoning in the city, could the council not have the discretion to make that change then? I mean, even though when we're talking about the entitlements, we're not necessarily taking away a lot from that.
Oh, no, you're taking away a whole lot.
What do you, so from 35 feet to 2 stories?
Oh, you're just talking about, yeah. Oh, you're talking about from the C4A to the low intensity. You're taking away a story. So that's essentially a third of their building capacity.
But I mean, in essence, if we're talking about controlling development already, because they could do so much in regards to building height, I mean, don't we have the discretion to make policy and to, you know, recommend what's best in the interest as far as stepping it away from the core and as far as protecting the neighborhood from, because there's a huge difference in my mind of 2 stories along Rosedale Drive at the max, 4 stories.
So our ability to make policy is balanced with the current landowner's current rights. One's not, you don't, one doesn't trump the other necessarily. The property owner has certain rights, and so you have to balance whatever we're doing, because if a court determines that what we do infringes on those rights too much, then we can't do it. The court can hold that we've gone too far. And that's what I believe, Susan, you correct me if I'm wrong, that's what you're talking about in terms of when you are making an ordinance enforceable, if you have gone too far in your policy making such that you've infringed on the right, unreasonably infringed upon the rights of the current property owner, then it becomes an unenforceable ordinance.
So
Exactly.
By taking away a story, though, the concern is taking away some of their rights, but in turn, we are giving them mixed use, which possibly gives them more development potential of the property, because then it could be office, residential, or commercial, or, you know, live work. Whereas in the current situation, they may be looking at commercial or office only. So in a way, there's an exchange from that.
Absolutely, with everything in this plan, that is one of the counterbalances is use.
Well, I mean, I know you and I have talked about it before, and I just, you know, it remains my biggest concern. I love a lot of the changes that have happened so far, but I don't see the stepping away from the core, and I don't see the protection of the neighborhoods to the north, and I think that's important. Even if you go into the text of the master plan, it references specifically Rosedale and 27th Avenue as being low intensity and defines that in the policy section and shows pictures. I know it doesn't say 2 stories in the master plan, but it shows pictures of 2-story developments compared to medium intensity, which is a picture of a larger development. So that's just basically, that's my biggest concern. Thank you for all the changes. They've been great in respect to having lodging and doesn't not allowing blanket residential, but it's that quadrant that is, you know, that I just want to continue to discuss and hear from others about. So thank you.
Anybody else from the committee or council? Questions? Right, just here.
Just a quick follow-up to the issue of the discussions with property owners downtown. We did a great job of capturing the surveys and survey results from residents related to our master plan. I'm wondering, is there any documentation at all related to discussions held with property owners as we were going through this process, asking them their opinions about the land use map versus the zoning? Any sort of documentation or minutes from any of those meetings?
We wouldn't have minutes. We have protest letters that were submitted to the city clerk. Yes. And that was help me, that was before the December 2019. It was like, they were submitted a day or two before the December city council public hearing.
And do we know how many protest letters, and can we have access to those?
I mean, Shannon Walchuk, that whole development that they have right off of 31 coming into 28th Avenue, they were one of the major ones. But yeah, I mean, it's public records request, yeah.
And then, so in following the iterations of our zoning maps, I have a 2016, excuse me, a June 2019 zoning map that was showing the strip there closest to Highway 31 and north of 28th Avenue as medium intensity. And I'm just wondering what, if the landowners had made, had those meetings prior to the December, what has changed since the June zoning draft, and what we're seeing today to raise the strip north of 28th Avenue to the strip by Independence Drive, closest to 31, from medium intensity to high intensity.
If the question
that
is
was
for
part of the
me, I
project.
can't hear it.
Yeah, it's part of the protest letters that were submitted.
Okay.
That was
Some of the
the major
property
chunk,
owners
that was the
subject
major
to the
chunk of it.
Okay. So
And
did anybody protest in the 2 blocks off of Rosedale Drive? Or the area that we're talking about,
Across, yeah.
do we know?
I can't recall off the top of my head, but I know the majority of it was that. And I will say back to Nick's question, if you look at the future land use map, what's shown in medium density residential that abuts Rosedale, it's, we're obviously showing existing zoning, which is R5 attached. Look, we've eliminated that whole area from actually becoming part of the rezoning. So we actually took out, we made a buffer, basically. We left the zoning to be where Spring Park is and the R5. We left that as is and didn't even include it in this.
Yeah, I mean, I think that actually had a similar question, if we could, in a way, retract that along Rosedale Drive. In between Rosedale Drive and 27th Avenue, if we could kind of pull that out from this consideration, but it had already been advertised, so we could continue to discuss it, but it had already been advertised. So I know that we can at this time.
I've been asked many times, and I'll just say, where did these boundaries come from? The map was drawn by previous engineer Greg Cobb and city planner to begin with. That's how they drew that future land use map. And from there, we had to, look at the existing zoning and what would make the most sense. So a lot of what's along Oxmoor and Central, you'll notice that we actually eliminated that. We're leaving some of that C1 office building area to be the same, and then Parkside and all that. And Susan can correct me, but that's partly because you get a little bit more suburban form and feel over there than the more downtown core. But knowing that the city had the CMAQ transportation, basically they were getting federal funding for streetscape improvements along 18th Avenue. That's why we included that north side of 18th where Rosedale would be coming in, knowing that that intersection might look kind of like an out intersection today, but the whole vision is for that, the downtown Main Street to continue to go down there. You've seen the streetscape improvements that the Valley Hotel did, but the whole idea is thinking about those parcels in the future that it's not going to be a big intersection anymore. When they do finally let the project and get it constructed, you're going to have sidewalks all the way down there, and the form and feel of that area is going to change a little bit. But again, we're trying to protect Rosedale by saying, well, we're still going to cap it at 2 stories. It might be live work buildings, it might just be office buildings. But just because you say it's mixed use or allows mixed use doesn't mandate that you have to have 2 types of uses in the same building. You can still just have just office. You can have just retail. But if you want to, have an art gallery over on Linden and live in it upstairs, it's not allowed today under the current zoning code. And so we're trying to allow that.
I feel like with the code, I definitely get the change from the existing code with, I guess, Euclidean zoning to form-based and simplifying the
Well,
number of
it's
districts.
hybrid. It's not form-based.
Okay, so the hybrid. So from the form standpoint, I think there's definite improvements to bring, keeping the built environment pedestrian friendly. uses. We've hashed through a lot of capping, lodging, having additional process for residential. And it really is at this point for me, the intensity of that northern quadrant of downtown, where it's not really a quadrant, but there's actually in the master plan, it's broken into threes: northern downtown, Soho downtown, and central, basically. And I feel like Soho downtown in that master plan map includes the parcels immediately north of 28th Avenue South. And then it starts to stair step behind it from the north on 28th is high, and then it goes medium, and then it goes low. If you look at that map, it breaks it down at 3 in the master plan. And in this one, there's just not that transition.
The land use versus the zone.
Thank you.
All right, any other questions from the council or committee? Okay, so we will take questions from the public. If you are going to ask a question of Susan or Lindsay or anyone, come up to the front, sign in, name and address, please. And use the microphone, and what's that? 2 minutes for a question, that's plenty of time. And please be respectful, relevant, on point. And did I mention respectful? Who's up?
Can I ask Barry, can you get rid of the slides and put the people back on the screen?
Brian, you mean that for Brian?
Brian, sorry.
It's really going to Zoom. not
Yeah,
so much
okay.
in here.
All right, I've got 2 issues. Beverly LaBeouf, and I'm chair of the board zoning adjustment, so you can imagine where I'm going with this. Section L, talking about the parts that come to the BCA. We have not ever handled these issues before. We don't do traffic studies. We've never asked for any information from the schools or any of that in the past. It's always been the planning commission, at least for the last 9 years. Last 6.5, I've been on the BZA, 2.5 before that, I was the reporter for the Homewood at Large blog. So for the next 9 years, I've spent my first Thursdays at the BZA meetings. So that's something we've not done. I don't know what the standards are for that we need to look at. Fire department always does, fire marshal has told us when he had a problem with the design, and we discussed that and taken care of that, those recommendations. But as far as police, demographer, that sort of thing, we've never done it. And we will, so I don't have any problem doing it. My question just is, will we get training on that and help understanding what that is? My other issue is, this covers just 6 dwelling units. And in my mind, what I see happening is going down one of these streets over here. They apply for one building and it's got 6 units in it. And they don't have to come to us, so they don't have to do any of that. And that gets built. 6 months later, next door, they want to build another one. And next door, they want to build another one. And it goes all the way down the block and down the street. And they've never been before anyone. And so we don't know what police department is. We don't know what fire department, well, we know something fire department. We don't know what the schools have to say about it and all that. So I'm very concerned that they could piggyback them all the way down a block and we're stuck with the whole street being it before you know it.
Is there a question in there? Is that?
Yeah, well, you change it.
The BZA, so the BZA,
So, yeah, I'll address a little bit of that, particularly the first part of the question. The burden would be on the developer, as it's written now, to bring you that information. The BZA, and when I say you, I'm talking about the BZA. The BZA would not be the entity that would be required to go get information or to make the argument that something was or was not going to be affected in some way. That burden would be on the developer to go get the objective information from the schools, police, traffic, all of that, the parking, all of that stuff, and bring that to you as the BZA for you to review. In terms of training and things like that, absolutely. Whatever questions the BZA needed to.
We don't know if that makes sense or if it's any good or.
Sure. So
That's what it should be.
if it is considered to be a negative effect, then you have the ability to deny it. But yeah, well, I mean, we've never been shy about doing training, so I don't think we would be now.
Leslie Templeton. I wondered, I missed some of the meetings, but has there been a study from a traffic point of view, a traffic study, if these implementations go into effect, what the maximum impact could be if everybody built 4-story or 2-story addition to number 1 parking and to our 2-lane roads? At lunchtime, it's kind of hard to get around already. I mean, has there been a study of what the impact would be? That's my question.
Great, thank you.
You just said, or Susan wants to-
And an additional question is, sure. Is it going to be per building impact? When you say a traffic study is supposed to be done, do we have the ability to turn it down because of the impact on our road?
Sure. So I'm going to take the second one, and anyone else wants to handle the first one. With regard to the second one, so the answer is yes, but only with regard to what we're talking about is in high intensity. When a developer would like to build more than 6 units, then they would have to submit something specific to their development. It would require a development plan. It would require them to get objective information from the schools, police, dealing with traffic, dealing with parking, and they would have, and the burden is then on them to establish that there's not a negative effect with their development. If there is a negative effect, and the negative effect could be they're adding 1 student, they're adding 1 parking place, whatever it is, if that's deemed to be a negative effect with that development, then the development can be denied. So it looks at it specifically. So what this does is it tends to look, or it looks at it rather than making a blanket of, at least with regard to the residential issue, of yes, you can do it, or no, you can't. It requires them to specifically address their development and how it will affect these issues that everyone has rightfully been concerned about. And that development will be viewed on its own with regard to those criteria. It would also include sort of the process we're doing now. It would include a public hearing where the public could come and say, I'm concerned about this development because of its effect on traffic, or its effect on parking, or its effect on schools, or its effect on all 3. And I want you to hear my voice so that you can make a decision based upon what my experience is and what my concerns are with regard to that specific development.
As far as the first question, you get one development that only has 1 parking place and 1 student. Next development has 5 parking places and 5 students, and all of a sudden, each one individually, at the end of this, has been a traffic study done for the cumulative effect of making that decision. I mean, let's just say,
Sure.
what's in purple there, it had 200 people, 200 cars.
And what you're talking about is if there were a 6-unit development on each parcel, sort of going down the line.
That's what it's going to be approved, right?
Yeah, so a 6-unit development would not require the same process, only when it got above 6. You're correct.
Jennifer.
Has there been a study or something?
Jennifer,
There's-
this is Joe Eccles. I cannot hear when someone does not have a microphone, their questions.
Okay, okay,
We'll make sure.
yeah. We can hold the
We'll make
microphone.
sure.
Tom, there was a parking study that was done, but we've not done a traffic study, no, but there has been a parking study.
Was it 6 miles down?
The parking study was done in the fall of 2018, and I will again tell you that does not appear to change. I've been down here all the time. There's
doesn't
plenty of parking
include
underneath
hotel,
City
right?
Hall. What's that?
It does not include.
It does not, but I will also tell you that again, I stand with the City Hall parking that is available, that is open there, a million spaces down there all the time, and that is the
It
same,
doesn't include the city hall, that's a question.
the hotel.
It
It was
doesn't
done in
include
the fall of
hotel,
2018.
which is
So,
fine.
understand. Okay, who's next? Questions?
But someone can call me if they need to. Okay. Hey, Sydney Simmons. I have two questions. One was it ever, Denny, take this off. Was it ever explored legally to decide whether or not we could grandfather in the current owners in the downtown area and give them the full ability of their buildings? And then if they sold their property and it moved to new owner, they would be held to the new standards of that one. The other was, do we know how much property in the area that's impacted with this rezoning has changed hands since this process began? And then I had another one and I'm forgetting what I was going to ask that was related to. Well, I asked this.
Susan, do you want to take the grandfather question?
Yes. All property owners downtown they will become, and if Mr. Kendrick is in the room, maybe he should take this question, but they will become either conforming or non-conforming. And they have protection to continue as they are unless they make a major change to their building, like tear it down and start over. So if they change their value substantially, then they will be obligated to the new code. If they can make changes that bring it closer into compliance with the code and still remain in effect as they are today. There's nothing that I'm familiar with, and once again, I defer to your counsel, but we've never written a code, and I'm not familiar with the process of only being obligated to your prior entitlements, and that changes upon resale. I'm just not familiar with that tool. It's interesting thought.
It's illegal now. Use, non-conforming uses go with the land. You're a auction law. So as long as they're non-conforming, someone can sell a parking lot, the non-conforming uses maintained. So no, it would not be permissible for all non-conforming status. Punish them. That's probably not.
So if someone, as the current owner, wanted to build, and if this passes the way that it is, if the current owner wanted to build an 11-story building, they would be non-conforming, it would not be allowed.
So under the, are you talking about if the
this
proposal passes, they would not be able to build an 11-story building?
Okay, so that's where the taking comes into play. That's why we
Correct. They
wanted to
currently
do that.
can if
Right.
on certain parcels, but they currently can. This would prevent that and would cap the height depending on the intensity, either at 5, 4, or 2.
I'm wondering about that simply because a lot of that property seems to have already sold recently and has been redeveloped. So I'm just curious as if that's a reality versus if it's just something we're expecting may or may not happen. The other thing to Nick's point was, if we are looking, say we did kind of go back to what the original the land use, if we went back to that version and were something closer to that and we enforced it on that side, do we feel like there is a consensus that enough of the current owners would protest? I know we said there were a few, but or is it something like we're expecting the majority majority, or how many have we actually heard from?
Here's the real problem with that. Land use plan is what you would like it to be. That in the middle is what it really is. That's what I'd like to have. So you talk about philosophically what you'd like it to be, really you're bound by what it is, and why it's bad. So the land use map on the left is helpful for planning, it's only a planning tool. The land use map, the zoning map in the middle is what people can make use of their property today by law. So you're focusing on something that really is not dictating or doesn't control the uses of property. The middle map controls.
Look, someone, we left it, if we went back to Sunburst and closer to this, someone sues the city. Do we know in history kind of how often someone's actually able to win against the city in that case, if they feel like they're making a decision that's best for the city?
Well, it depends on what lawsuits you want to get into. If you want to take a position that you know is not going to be sustained, if you take a position that you can defend, you have a better chance of being successful. Successful, but you take reason and decision. You haven't taken time to discuss. See for the last 35 years. Successful, but we've been reasonable about it.
So to this aspect, I mean, what we're talking about with medium density to low intensity, again, currently the middle map on Rosedale Drive allows C4A 35 feet. And so you're saying it's a taking to go to low intensity, which only allows 2 stories and not 3. Okay. So you're not saying that that wouldn't be unreasonable?
You have to look at each piece of property.
Okay. Thanks.
I just want to say that it's been said over and over again that this simplifies the code. By adding residential, you are not simplifying the code. And that's just a fact. And so the taking was an excellent point that Mr. Sims made, and I will definitely be voting for you in the future. That was a brilliant point, because that's where all the complication comes in. If you were to do this plan and you don't add residential, not a lot's gonna happen. Susan herself said that apartments were the economical engine, quote unquote, for cities. And although Homewood didn't really fit that because we're this great thriving place, then, you know, it was still the reason it was put in there. But we got this outlying situation called Brookwood Mall that we don't know what's gonna happen, that we're probably gonna have Susan's magic bullet called residential added to get it to do anything. So the question is, until we know why in the heck we're gonna do with Brookwood Mall or what's gonna happen to Brookwood Mall in terms of apartments, why would we ever agree to allow stick-built apartments or any other type of apartments and residential into an area that's considered the heart of Homewood? If you take away what the zoning is here, it looks like the rest of Homewood. From what I hear, everybody loves downtown Homewood, the heart of Homewood, and we want to try to protect and preserve. So if you don't add residential, you might end up with that, number one. Number two, the parking requirements, we've been asking for parking for 25 years, so the parking requirements still need to be addressed. That's a question of Susan.
30 seconds. So
Okay.
you have a question.
When you have a good point up here, sometimes it gets a little long.
Amen.
But anyway, at the end of the day, I think the problem is, and I have this question for Mike Kendricks, residential has already been allowed on 18th Street, and people have lived in those buildings. So is that a taking? And the hotels that could come all over this map are resident or hotels, is that a taking? Well, wait a minute.
Residential's not permitted on 18th Street today.
But they have been doing it for
Well,
years.
so they're doing illegal stuff.
Okay, but that's my point. That's my point. That's my point. It's not really enforceable,
Brookwood
Ron.
Mall has nothing to do with this plan.
It does because it affects our community.
All right.
Yeah, but it's the magic bullet according to Susan Henderson, which we gave $300,000 to give us her advice. And her
So,
advice was it
Mr.
was a
Shea, the
magic
answer
bullet.
to your question was
Middle Ricker.
that on 18th Street, there's residential is not currently
It
allowed.
has been happening for over 100 years.
If it's happening today, it's happening illegally.
Okay,
That's the
well,
point.
what I'm saying
So-
is, how are you enforcing it is the point. You're not, it's for people living on 18th Street now and you're not enforcing it. So how are we gonna enforce it?
So we should allow residential on
My
18th
point,
Street.
my point is, why does adding residential simplify a plan? And why, if Susan says the magic bullet is apartments and what you need, why are we adding it here when we're gonna need it at Brookwood Mall?
You and I have had this conversation
No,
many times.
We're all here having this conversation right now.
I've had it many times
I
with
should
everyone.
answer my question. Why does
We
adding,
talk, we
why
talk.
does adding
If-
residential?
Let me-
if
can
you
I say
arrest
from-
me answer,
For what it's
I will
worth,
answer.
I have constituents in Ward 5 who have expressed interest in living downtown. I find properties like the new Gold Nugget property that's going up on 18th Street, lovely. I see this back behind you. I think it's lovely. I have constituents that I represent who
Available
want.
apartments now in Homewood.
I'm telling you that,
You can
again,
give
this
them a
Gold
realtor.
Nugget property up here, I think is an excellent example of what we're talking about. It's small, it's not gonna impact the school system, period.
Jennifer, what this is could affect.
All right,
Thank
we
you.
don't pass the time. Next person, who else would like asking questions?
I think the last gentleman that spoke, I think his main thing is what we're all thinking. What do we want to pass? So we won't put forth what limits residential. Most people, can't speak for everybody, but most people I've spoken with doesn't want any more apartments in Homewood because that will affect our schools. And so we are wanting to know what studies y'all have done that will show us what impact that will have on the schools. We don't want any more apartments.
So,
Can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah. Susan, I'll repeat. The question was, how will residential, I'm paraphrasing, how will residential be limited under the new plan? And my answer would be this. So just to sort of go back through the history, because I don't know who knows the history and who doesn't. So the plan before May, when we had our public input sessions or public forums, I think is what we call it. The plan at that point allowed blanket residential as a matter of right downtown with the new plan with mixed use. We heard from many people with a concern about residential and the amount of residential in particular. And so what we did was we created a new system. So medium intensity allows 6 units. That's where the 6 units came from. That's where that number comes from. And so that was pulled over to high intensity. If you are seeking to create a development that has residential in it in high intensity, that concern was one of the major concerns. There were 3 that we heard over and over again. One was, how will it affect the schools? One was, how will it affect parking? And the other was, how will it affect traffic? And we were concerned that by allowing a blanket allowance of residential, that we or a disallowance, either one, that we wouldn't be able to judge each project on its own merits. So what we did was we created an additional review, an additional public review that would go to BZA as the zoning authority in the city. And that process would require any developer to submit, to one, go and collect information from the schools, from the police department, and from the city about parking, and get what the numbers are, gather their information, and then present how it was not going to negatively affect those things. So, and then they would submit that along with a full development plan to the BZA. The BZA would then have a public hearing that would be like what we're going to have on Monday night. And anyone that wanted to show up to speak to what was submitted could, and could speak to why they believe that has a negative effect on any or all of those. And that would, then the BZA would consider that, and if the BZA believes that has a negative effect, then the BZA, then that plan does not get approved. Mr. Kendrick, are you looking at?
In our zoning ordinance. Especially in our zoning ordinance, you keep a child in your home, you have to go to BZA. This is-
No, yeah, development plans go to planning commission.
That's not what you work on your house. Home occupation, you have to go to BZA. This is the only thing that's adding the same premises, but with more factors, more conditions, more review. It's not a new novel concept.
I cannot hear you.
Mike, can I ask you a question?
Well, I'm sorry.
Like, didn't you just say that wasn't really enforceable though?
No,
If
they
you
did
add
not.
residential, don't, why even add residential though?
So
That's not what I said.
Yeah.
I'm gonna go back to a question we had a couple of years ago. Could we regulate ownership of condos versus apartments? And that is not legal in the state of Alabama. So we couldn't do that. And we're also in other codes, they prescribe maybe a certain percentage of the building has to be residential. And we aren't doing that. We aren't even saying a certain percentage of any of the buildings have to be anything. It's left to the market to drive it.
So to go back to your question, what I'm trying to say is a developer that brings residential down here, tries to bring it to downtown, is going to have to go through this process so that we all know exactly what is going to happen. That's the point.
What is
And
proposed
so
to happen.
if there's a development, for example, that is restricted to 55 and up, okay, well, that's probably not going to, well, not going to affect the schools, but you can't have a child in that kind of development. Otherwise, can the developer say that there aren't going to be children in the development? I don't know any way that they can. You know, so they're going to have to address those issues and make it part of their submission to overcome their burden if they can. But that's how it'll be reviewed on an individual basis rather than a blanket.
I have a question.
So, okay. So there are two things going on with residential. One, we got requests for residential downtown in the Heart of Homewood plan and surveys. That has been a request. Ms. Andrews just talked about, we get requests all the time about that. There is a substantial portion of the population that would like to have some more residential downtown. The other thing is what Mr. Sims referred to earlier, which is the increase in use offsets the taking that we're doing with the rest of the property. So in other words, because, and I believe the Sims referred to this as well, because you can build however tall now, and we're going to cap it, we are taking some of the use of that property. We're taking some of their value in that property by doing it. And by increasing the use, we offset that, which makes it a more enforceable statute. But we provided this review of the process of any residential in order to make sure that any residential that does come doesn't have a negative effect.
And I want to clarify when I say constituents that want to move downtown, who I'm talking about that I have conversations with are people who are, you know, no more kids in the nest, downsizing, want to stay in Homewood. That's the population that I represent in Ward 5 that has spoken of wanting to have.
It's not a majority.
Well, it is for me. Who I talk to. Yep. And we're not having extemporaneous comments. We're not having extemporaneous comments. We're gonna have questions as per.
I have a
Hi,
question,
my name's Kristen
Jennifer.
Metter and I live in Ward 5 and I'm actually, I work within the real estate community. So I have a couple of things to say about that. So as we've seen, a lot of these type condominiums pop up around our city, Mountain Road Village, down by Railroad Park, and they're not filling and they continue to build and build and build based on need. I'm an empty nester. Not going to say that I wouldn't love to be able to walk to all my favorite stomping grounds down here. But my question is, are we even at capacity down here? Because I don't think we are. I do a lot of transactions down here. also, it's not really fair, is it, to these people that invested initially in all these projects to lower their property value when you're creating more properties that can be bought? So therefore, instead of having the nice, beautiful penthouse at Soho, there's going to be 30 more of those possible. So I mean, are we considering that, one, and are we at capacity? And if we build apartments or multi-use and they can't sell, then do those become apartments like up on Oxmoor?
So, just to be clear, the city's not building anything. We're not building anything. We're not asking for anything to be built. This is about zoning and what can be done. And to your point, about the people in these apartments and their property value, I don't think the city can sort of protect that any more than it can say, we're not going to allow someone to build a nice house next to someone else's house that might reduce their property value. With your ownership of the land, you have certain rights. What the city can do is it can control zoning, and that's it. We don't choose what comes in. We don't try to build something on our own. This is about zoning and use and what is allowed and what is not allowed.
I wasn't saying the city was going to build.
I know.
I was saying that it opens it up.
I understand, but I think some people might have taken it that way. That's why I answered it that way.
Yeah, I think my follow-up. So for the burdens, if I purchase two pieces of property next to each other, which division of the city has to grant that those can be rezoned into one?
So resurveyed into one parcel would be the planning
Commission. Okay.
They would have the final say on that.
And then the developer comes in, they have to go for the planning commission to request, and then it goes to DCA. So that's the whole process.
So, just, and it may be that I'm misunderstanding your question. So to resurvey it into one parcel only goes to the planning commission. It doesn't come to us, doesn't go to DCA.
No, after that.
And then if they wanted to
wanted to
build
develop,
over 6
correct.
units, then that would go to the DCA.
Okay, so I think where I just keep having a hang up is with this exception, because if we're limiting it to 6, then why are we kind of building this caveat of, okay, well, if we want to go further, is it because we expect it? Do we think that's happening? I think that's my concern, is if we think that we're going in a direction where there's going to be residential in this area, why don't we kind of deal with that reality and then put a further limit? Is it 12 units? Is it 30 units? Is it what may be down the road? I just think dealing with, okay, we're okay with 6 at 5 stories, but if somebody wants to go further than that, they have to go through this process. When we could just say, okay, what would we be okay capping a big parcel? I just don't know that this, in the way that it is written, has standards that are high enough to really ensure that we're not going to end up with something that we don't want. Because beyond that 6 unit limit, there is no limit next. I guess that's my concern, is there's no other, and I know that it has to go for the BZA, but I don't know. This, to Beverly's question, is, are they going to be given a standard of what's acceptable in the request from the police, the fire, the school? Like, are they going to be given anything to go by? I think there just seems to be a lot of ifs, ands, or buts for those of us that haven't been fully involved in every part of this
That's not
plan.
usually, they could do the 6 units and then build another 6 units and build another 6 units all the way down the block, and it would never come before us.
That means somebody's got to own all that property.
Well, I think
Right, but they,
it's
but they could buy them.
feasible.
They can buy it.
They choose who want to build the house. You have to go, you have to own the property.
But I do think it's feasible. It's what we're saying. It's feasible that someone could purchase. I mean, this was rezoned into 1. I mean, it's possible that this could happen. And I think we're concerned that if we don't limit it, that we are opening ourselves up to that possibility. And really, that would have a huge impact. We're not going to get off a tangent, but that would severely change the way that our downtown looks in the field and the community that we have. So I just want to make sure that we're looking down the road and really making sure that we have a solid plan. I think that's my biggest thing.
I've got a question. Joe Eccles has got a question on Zoom that I'm happy to take. Hey, Joe Eccles, can you hear me? Joe, you still with us?
Yes, I can hear hear you. Can you hear me?
Go ahead, Joe.
Okay, really, my question, the lady before the present lady spoke about the occupancy downtown. All right, we do, I mean, of course, we can't tell, the city doesn't build it. I understand that, that we're permitting, but we are permitting developers for building certain things. That's what the whole zoning's about, what we want, what we're permitting. So if we're permitting to have even 6 units downtown, we should look at what is going on at the Hill, what's going on at Hallman Hill, what's going at Soho, what is the occupancy? Have y'all looked at that? Have you gotten any numbers? Is there a need?
Susan,
I would say currently they're
Wait.
not.
Yeah,
Susan's trying to talk.
Susan's trying to talk, Brian.
Can I just make a statement? Do you mind? And then I'll defer to President Wyatt. But cities normally don't act like, what you're referring to, Joe, is acting like a private developer. Private developers do market studies. They do occupancy rates. They calculate demand, and then they determine whether or not their pro forma will work. Cities, particularly as it relates to zoning, don't do that. That's way beyond their staff capacity, it's beyond their expertise. But what they do is, like President Wyatt mentioned, they craft zoning. And at that point, then, if there's no demand, you will get no residential. If there's some demand, you will get residential as it is controlled and restricted by your zoning ordinance. But it's not that the market studies and the occupancy rates. I've never had a city client that did that.
Well, thank you, Susan. You did give an answer. But I do think the zoning, and Jennifer, I appreciate what you said about people that have said they would like to live downtown. I do think the city does listen. And if you want zoning, it's because you've heard zoning to have apartments. It's because you've heard people to come to you to say, let's do this. If you haven't, then I don't understand why we're going that area. But I understand what you're saying, Susan. It's not the city that can that needs to determine that. But I think we as citizens, you have people that come and say, I want it or I don't want it. And I would say, from what I hear, the majority of people are saying, we don't want that downtown. What the developers do, I know we don't want to put restrictions, but I do think I would like to know exactly why, if we have a lot of people objecting to it, that we are still pursuing it.
It's largely to do, my understanding is it's largely to do with the height problem. And don't give, I mean, you have in downtown Homewood, you have a height problem. Someone in the 80s, as I like to say, they gave away the farm. And the only way to negotiate with landowners that have that sort of entitlements to give it up is to give them something in return that they don't have right now. And the missing use in downtown is residential. So that's the trading card you have to negotiate for reduced heights.
Joe, I'll say, when we were scoping out the master plan and the zoning and talking to the previous city planner, she said, I need this for 2 reasons. One, to simplify the zoning code so
Right.
it's more enforceable, and for staff, I mean, the 13 different zoning districts, 6 of which are commercial zoning districts. And then she said, I'm running out of properly zoned land for what these developers are knocking on my door to do. I don't know what those developers were knocking on her door to do on the 4th floor 4 years ago, but that's just kind of how this all began. So again, I inherited a project that was started by people who weren't here. Your
Right.
current council inherited a project that,
Right.
that they didn't start. So we're all
Right.
trying to, hear each other out and go through now 6 rounds of edits, because that means somebody's been listening.
I want to thank you all for allowing us to do our input tonight. But I have make an answer to it. But when someone addressed you about Alex, that when you implied that the city's not developing anything, that is true. But what you allow this plan to do is allow people to do.
Absolutely.
And I think we all understand that. The second thing is, I don't know hardly anyone in this room. I would just like to know who in this room is for the plan. Is anyone? Okay, so we have one out of all these people. Are we building our city for what developers want or what the citizens want?
So my response to that would be that this plan is actually being more restrictive on developers. That's the point of the plan, is that it is more restrictive as to what they can do. It is about protecting downtown from becoming something that it is not currently today. And if we don't do something, and you and I have had many conversations on this, and I appreciate every one of them. And you and I have talked in the past where we agreed, and I think everyone in the public forums agreed. A change in the zoning is needed. No one has ever argued to, well, they argued the last time, but no one this time around has argued to me that changes to the zoning is not needed. I think everyone has agreed with that. Everyone is concerned about it. We may be concerned about different things depending on who you're talking to about the current zoning. Some people are more concerned with height. Some people are more concerned with use. But there is a need to address zoning, and I think we all agree with that. So, and just to answer your question, my only pushback on you is I don't think that this plan is benefiting developers, and that's my only point. Yeah, go on.
So if we can agree that something needs to be done, why can we not go back to what the 2007 or something in that arena?
Sure. So I think that's what we've been talking about, and certainly different people can have different opinions. There's not, as I said, everyone's going to focus on a little bit different point of emphasis. Right. So, okay. So, right. Okay. But so we've talked about that there are reasons dealing with takings. There are reasons dealing with a number of things. We have also added additional restrictions to try to get to, quite frankly, whether it's 2007 or 2016 or 2021, what we're trying to do is get to a plan that meets what everyone within reason wants to have. We're never all going to agree, but there is consensus around a number of things. Protecting downtown, in particular, protecting 18th Street and 29th Avenue. There is general consensus about areas that might need some redevelopment. And there is concern about certain things like residential, and in particular, high-rise residential, adding a large number of rooms, or units, I guess I should say, not rooms, I apologize. Adding a large number of units. And that's why we have, again, changed the plan to try to address that so that we can review those projects individually, review their effect on the city, and allow the city to reject those if it's going to have a negative effect.
I also want to mention just real quick, the folks on Linden and Crescent are good. And you're Linden Crescent, you're on Linden Crescent, aren't you? Yeah, like those folks spend a lot of time meeting with each other, working through the plan together. They came to Susan and Lindsay and they asked for some changes we made early on in the process. They have continued to meet, and we thank them for that. And so that section of the plan is very well received. So,
And I'm just gonna say objectively, as a planner, as a regional planner that is eligible to work in 6-county region of Birmingham, I've gone into a lot of cities. And it's usually the vocal minority that's yelling the most. So there's a lot of silent majority people that might not, so you might be, saying, raise your hands tonight, but those people aren't here because they don't have a problem with it. The people that are always showing up are the vocal minority.
I'm Jenny Allen. I own a property on Linden Avenue and I live on Homewood Drive. I've owned a property on Linden since 1985. So I'm not a developer. I just happen to own this property. I have loved it. It has been wonderful. But if there is potential to do something else with it in the future, I'm not going to do something crazy with it. It's not anything that's going to be an 11-story anything. But clearly, the two plans on the left are much more confusing than the plan on the right. Going down to 3 zones gives you something based on fact. And what you have on the 2 maps to the left, you have things based on opinion. And a factual, evidence-based zoning policy just makes a lot more sense to me. And I would think it would make more sense to others. It would just give you something you could hang your hat on. You could know you're low intensity, medium, high. You know what's expected of you. And it's just a much simpler plan. My real question for the evening is a very simple one. I do own Linden, and I did. It was really wonderful for the owners on the B streets, the low intensity owners, to get together. This was back in 2019. And kind of hash some things out and talk and meet and have interviews and talk with y'all and discuss with Susan Henderson. These are really level-headed, common sense decisions. But we did have one question that lingered.
20 seconds.
We didn't get an answer back in 2019. And our question is simple. If Linden Avenue is a B street, just as Crescent is a B street, why does the zoning stop? Why is there a break in the zoning on Crescent? That was our only question. Whereas Linden goes all the way up to Oxmoor, but Crescent has a break in it.
Susan, did you hear that? I know you said you were having trouble hearing some of the questions.
I did not hear it.
Okay, Jenny Allen had a question.
Let's re-ask it.
Okay.
Let me see.
I'm gonna let you do it.
Susan, can you hear me?
Can you hear Alex?
Okay. So the question, and Jenny, correct me if I'm wrong. The question is, why does the zoning stop with Crescent as you proceed south towards Oxmoor? There's a break in the Crescent Avenue as you proceed south towards Oxmoor, but there is not one in Linden. Can you address what the difference is in those 2 streets?
I need to defer that to Lindsay because that came out of the master plan. We only addressed the properties that were identified as mixed use in the rezoning effort. And those were never identified as mixed use.
Talking about across the street.
I mean, they're commercial now. I mean,
The 2 at the end of Crescent. Yeah, right there.
Yeah, that's the church.
And that's the church.
Right here.
That's the church.
We left out the church.
Yes, exactly.
Right here versus right here. So
We left out the church and the Bell Center.
All the way to Oxmoor, and Crescent stops church is further down. You've got 17,
I guess we were looking at this, you know,
and you've got a chiropractor's office, and I mean, you've got others. So we were just curious as to why they were treated one way, because it seems like other urban designs have, the line of demarcation is some kind of geographical boundary, a river, a street, or something. And that just kind of stopped.
I can only guess because it's C1 office building now, and it's only allowed for pretty much commercial
If you
office.
look
But
at-
look at
yeah.
existing zoning
Look
right
at the
there.
existing zone. It's an office, like, that's office.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, so see, that's why we. kind of
So
pushed
their
that
existing
out.
land use under C2 neighborhood shopping and the a little bit darker red allows them more uses today than just the C1. So
So that was, see, that's so much easier.
Here is that, can I interrupt for a second?
Sure.
There have been a number of people in that general area that have asked about this. And, you know, if the code is adopted, then as a phase 2, the city could elect to consider those properties, but they haven't been a part of the overall engagement process. So you would almost have to start, you know, by discussing it with everyone to make sure that there was enough continuity and desire to include them all. There were a number of other smaller properties, especially along Central, that were originally excluded, and then they became included because they petitioned the process early. But just because it doesn't happen now, Jenny, doesn't mean that it can't happen. Maybe it's just the next phase.
Okay, well, I mean, that's helpful to know. We were just curious as to
Yeah.
why the differentiation was made on
it
present.
probably goes back to
and
the
was
existing
not.
zoning today. Yeah, but they could, if this gets adopted, you all as property owners can ask for rezoning of your property to LI.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else?
May I apologize, first of all, I would like to apologize to Mr. Kendrick because I was not clear. When I indicated more like this on the left, I wasn't advocating for all those colors and everything. I'm advocating more for the light purple over there. Is what I'm advocating for.
Thank you.
My name is Mary Ann Pitts. I'm going to say thank you all. That it's just been an ongoing, long process. I understand the need to change from 13 to a lesser number. That makes sense. I guess my question is, when we hear that the medium and the high intensity can have 6 apartments per parcel, how many parcels is that? Like, you know, I think the overwhelming majority of us don't really want more apartments, more residential, more burden on, you know, having to have, I think right now it says 1 parking space. I don't know many people that have 1 car that live in an apartment. So I just see that with allowing the mixed use, that we're gonna have more traffic issues, more parking issues, and a greater burden on our schools. And I understand that all that has to be, you know, it goes through a process. But then I go, okay, but we haven't had a traffic study since the hotel's been here. So like, there is the traffic issue. There's a parking issue. I mean, you know, I try to avoid downtown from 11 to 1 because you can't get down there. So I guess I'm curious, how many parcels do we have between the medium and the high times 6? And then with that loophole that says, if you get those adjustments made and those questions answered, or you go through that process, you have a greater number. So like, what's the potential of the number of apartments we could have? That's, you know, I mean, do we have a number of parcels between the medium and the high intensity?
I will tell you, I don't know if
It's,
I can count them. Well, you also got condos in there, so.
Yeah, all residential.
One thing to consider with the number of parcels is, now I'm putting on my architect's hat, every one of those downtown parcels won't deliver 6 units. It's not technically possible because of you have a number of incredibly small parcels. And once you account for the amount of zoning and open space required, they won't all deliver 6 units. So just multiplying 6 times the number of parcels really won't get you an accurate number.
anybody else?
I know this is supposed to just be questions, but I do want to thank the council members for what y'all have been through over the last 3 years. What you've been through over the last 3 years trying to deal with this. And I guess what I want to go back to is why we've been trying to deal with it. And what I've heard is that there's, you could have an 11-story building. Well, you could have an 11-story building in the middle area, anywhere where it's dark red. I guess the darkest red is where you could have an 11-story building. There's only one building there, and I'm setting aside Homewood Hill. I mean, Homewood Hill, the initial part of it was done really well, and they ran out of money. So the second part, I don't think was. But Regions was built in the mid-'80s. So if we're under such a threat from an 11-story building, why over the last 36 years hasn't there been another 11-story building built? In fact, my wife and I walked through, because we live right across the street on 31, and I appreciate Jennifer being from Ward 5. She's going to try to get us a way to get across 31, which would be great, that little bridge across 31. That'd be terrific. But when we walked through there the other night, everything was 2-story. Like, we walked every street from 28th Avenue all the way up to Rosedale and back down. And everything in there was 2-story. Trisha's, I don't know what this is. I mean, I think it's 2-story, but maybe it's a little taller. So Trisha's been redone. Right? She painted it. Sykes has gone in. It's a really exciting new development. Architectural Heritage has gone in. There are a number of the doctor's offices that have redeveloped. So in my view, if it's been 11 stories all these years, and it's only 2 stories, and 2 stories is the current best use of the property under C4B. And that's the way I'd like to see it stay. C4B is a large portion, only when you get over here towards Central Avenue, Preston Avenue, you wind up with all these other, well, it's kind of like spot zoning. Okay, and if the council wants to do low intensity over there with some medium intensity, well, I guess it's all low intensity. I think that's a great use of zoning for that particular part of town. My concern is rezoning C4. And so my question is, on appeal, so currently, as I understand it, if you do 6 units, 6 residential units, you can only have only one parking space is required. If you go up from 6 units, and I talked with Mr. Kendrick about this earlier, he's kind enough to talk to me about it. And I think if we go up on appeal before the board, that the board could require more than one parking spot. Which if we're going to have a bunch of apartments on appeal, which could happen, right? And I would like the city council to have the ability to, or the board, to require more than one, parking spot per apartment. And my wife, Bunny, said, well, it's Mike's behind it. Like, you only have one car that.
So I think that Mr. Kendrick, you correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that what would happen in that process is that they would have to, well, I know that they have to address parking. If the BZA felt like what they were proposing was going to have a negative effect on parking for downtown, then it doesn't make it through.
No, President Wyatt, at the moment, parking is not on the list, just traffic.
Parking's on the list.
Parking is required. The number of spaces are required, but parking is not a condition of the uses on appeal.
She can't hear you. Hold on, Mike. Hold on, Mike.
Development plan criteria for BCA, location, parking areas, number of spaces with dwelling, need to vehicle and pedestrian access. So I think the number of spaces per dwelling unit.
I would think so too, based on my reading of it. So Ellis, I would tell you my reading of the plan is that, and I would, for any BZA or future BZA members that may be listening, as someone who's looking at this plan, that would be required. And if it's determined that it has a negative impact, then the plan can and should be denied. In high intensity, yes, correct. Mr. Lane, I think you put your name down.
Yeah, just one question.
Yeah, just making sure, sorry.
Yeah, the question I have is it possible next Monday night, if it's a public forum, could y'all kindly invite the school board superintendent to show up so we can ask him questions at the same time?
Well, so the answer to that question is no. Because here's the deal, the school board is not involved in this decision. Now, what will happen is, though, as part of this process, when these items come up, the school board will be involved because, or at least the superintendent will be involved, because that's where the information has to come from about schools or the application to the BCA. Yep. So it would be on an each proposal. It would be specific as to each proposal.
But what you said again, though, it doesn't have to go to BCA.
If it's under a certain number, correct.
Okay. But I was just curious for him to, somebody tell us what kind of impact, how many more students can we have?
Sure.
I mean,
and that's a good question. And that's why, and then you're raising a question, and it's a point that I want to make. That's part of the reason for having this system, because that number changes. It changes within the school year. It changes from year to year. It changes. Yeah, it changes all the time. And so that's one reason for looking at it on as to each development, because then they can give the accurate information at that time, and that can be included in the application.
My question. How defensible is a denial by the BCA for whatever grounds legally? Like, and so if you deny this person, or say you permit this person or this developer to they pass the BCA process, and then someone comes in right behind it, is that, I don't know, just have legal, I just wonder, is that legally, can they deny the very next person?
There's no absolute formula, 1, 2, 3 people, yes, people no, especially the facts of each case. It depends on the judge. So I can't give you an absolute answer if it can be defended or cannot. But I can tell you this, if there's more criteria which are all in this plan than there is existing precedent, then it's something that's important for us to
A few minutes ago, you said that's the rights of the property owner. And someone that raised a few questions and said, like, so kind of which is it? Yeah.
And that, Susan said that to begin with. That's just a principle of our country,
Right.
our law.
So if they have rights, I just wonder how defendable is a BZA denial.
It's really up to the judge. Here's the case. Evidence this was
But
Each case.
here's what I would point out. And this is part of the reason for the plan that we have with this objective criteria. The more objective criteria that has to be met, the easier it is to explain to that judge or whoever, this is what they missed, right? They didn't do this, as opposed to a system that's sort of wide open or where you're governing by variance.
Just saying yes or no.
And you're just saying yes or no because of whatever, but you haven't set out any criteria. That's when you run into really defensible problems, because that's when you get into something that's, the catchphrase is arbitrary and capricious. And as long as a city has a basis for making its decision, that's a much more defensible case than something where it's, we didn't like it or we did like it, and we kind of go different ways on different things. If you have a criteria that they have to meet, that's when you get them most defensible case. But can you guarantee a result? Sure.
Anyone else?
I have one last comment, and I promise I'll be quiet. So, well, the main thing I wanted to say is, one, I threw myself in the running to be in your guys' shoes, and right
Aren't you
now
glad
I'm really
you're
glad
not
that I'm not. But I do appreciate how long this has taken. I know you guys inherited it. I know I came in here hot with my questions, but the main thing is, I think we all have a vision for protecting the downtown. It may be different from each one of us, and I think the fact that we're arguing these little parts means that we're close. I think the biggest thing that I just can't let lie is this exception. I just really hope that we'll, in the next, I know it's already kind of written and we may not even be able to go back to it, but I think that's where, as I'm listening to the people that have talked tonight, the most concern seems to lie, in addition to Nick's point about the stair step down into the Roselle area. So I think I agree that we're all really close. I think we can get this done, but I'm just very so concerned about that exception and potentially putting such a burden on the BZA when they're not an elected body. I mean, you guys, you were elected so you can sit and stand and say the citizens and residents of Homewood have put me in this position. The BZA is appointed, so I just really feel like we're putting a lot of pressure on a group of people that has volunteered their time to serve on this on the board. And so I just wish there was a little bit more room to have, some protection for them, and also to give them, make sure we're giving them the tools that they have to review the process. I think I really left, but I think her point's really well taken, given that she's currently chair of that board, that they are going to need to have specifics and they can't just be handed a plan, because obviously someone that's coming to them with a plan wants to do it because they feel like they're going to be successful. So we need to make sure that we're protected to be able to say no if we want to say no. And so I think that's her main concern, is if we feel like something is going to be a negative impact, can we stand on that? So that's the main thing.
I would just want to say that the BZA exists for zoning. That is their
Yeah, so-
authority. That we're not placing this on them. That is their.
This is
authority.
actually a process that's set out in state law.
Yeah, this
so
is
it's not-
under their.
And
purview.
that doesn't, your
Right,
point is still
right.
valid.
Right.
And
But
we
just
will
so everyone
change it, right.
understands, this is not something we are
Creating.
creating and placing on the BCA. This is a state,
Completely
a process
understand
under state law that we're.
I think it's just when you look at it, a city that's as poppin', I'll say, as ours, and people want to live here and they want their kids to go to our school, I think we're right for the picking in certain situations. And I just want to make sure we're giving them the tools that they need to be able to evaluate each individual situation. Because even if there's any slight loophole, maybe anywhere, I just think we're opening ourselves up for an issue down the road.
I completely agree with you. The BCA needs to understand what they're doing, understand how to use this,
Right.
and use it in a way that they believe is the right way to use it.
And I don't know the answer to this. Has this been compared to the standard of any other city that has a process like this? Like, are we adopting something that's kind of across the board, a standard, or has this been created for us
So
specifically?
this appeal is a process in state law. Now, the criteria is specific to
We
us.
picked that,
Correct.
okay.
Go ahead, go on, sir.
One more question. We're talking about the BCA. and we're talking about the criteria they use, and that they have criteria, it's obviously up for interpretation. Case in point, pink house. Okay?
It's not
Wait.
relevant. at
Yeah, I
all
don't want to get
points.
into
We're
pink
not
house
pink
because
house.
we've got a whole thing
My
with that.
point is, it's up for interpretation. But you send this kind of thing to the BZA, then they are allowed to vote their interpretation.
Well, and so will we. But you can appeal. I mean, I would be too.
Well, but then also, then you have your front yard fence variances, and we're not talking about those tonight either. But sometimes people just take it off the table and then just leave the fence up.
Well, the fence is coming down, but that's a whole different issue, because I think I know what you're talking about. If you want to talk to me about that afterwards, I'll be happy to. But yes, the BZA is the body that's entrusted with making these kinds of decisions, just like we make certain decisions and planning commission makes certain decisions. That is their function. But to your point, yes, they can make the decision that they feel like is best. But we are also, that's one reason for providing them with specific criteria. One, that has to be met. There's a burden on the developer to meet that criteria. Two, that requires input from the public. And so they have to hear from the residents of Homewood, anyone that wants to show up at least. Is permitted by right to show up and voice their concerns. And that's why, that's they're not doing it just based on sort of a whim or feeling. And I'm not saying that you're saying that they were, but they have to do it according to this process, which does set out some specifics.
How will you communicate that out that it's a public hearing? Here's what's proposed. Please come and come.
Well, so it would be on the BZA agenda, which is published every time that the BZA meets, and is published in multiple places and on our website and online and in physical locations and all of that. So it would follow the process for it to set forth in state law.
Okay, any other comments? And we have got to get on to the tree ordinance. Okay, one more. I meant to say any other questions. Questions tonight.
My name is
Comments next
Amelia
week.
Jones, and I live in Edgewood. I've got young children, so my main concern with all of this is y'all are beating a dead horse, I know, with the interpretation and all that, but everything else in this plan is so detailed, and that section is just really vague. And I know that y'all have been talking about this for the last 5 questions, but my problem is, 10 people come in and do 6 units times however many kids and this and that. Well, then the schools will end up way too large, and we don't know the process that it'll take to get, accepted or whatever. And I mean, honestly, this is probably the most boring thing that I've ever had to sit through. And I don't want to have to come up here every time I want to fight an apartment complex or something that's going to add way more students to the elementary schools, and when they all come together in middle school and high school. So mainly that's my issues, not wanting to come to these meetings all the time. So
I can't say
That's the best point of the whole. That's the best point.
All right.
Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you all very much.
Sorry.
I mean, I don't really know what's going on, but I do have a question.
Questions are good.
My name is Leanne Logan. I know that the lady said that developers do, it's kind of like a certificate of need for apartments, the occupancy that Kristen talked about and what Joe Eccles talked about. Is there any way that we could do that? If we could maybe take a survey or study on how many apartments are unoccupied or condominiums are unoccupied. I mean, why can't we possibly do that and not let the developers do it? That's my question.
So and Susan, you correct me if I'm wrong. I think what Susan was saying is that that's not something that a city normally does. It's something that developers do in determining whether or not they want to do a project. In other words, and the same thing would be true of office space or retail space. So if there's, or rental houses or anything else, if there's not a need for it, developers have no reason to come do it. So for example, I don't know, as I sit here right now, how much office space is available or what capacity we're at for office space in downtown Homewood. But we're not talking about trying to determine that before we allow future office space to be developed. And so I think her point was that's part of the development process is if there's not a need for it, there's not going to be a development. Because why would you bring something that there wasn't a need for? How are you ever going to make money with that?
Yeah, and honestly, it's also letting the city off the hook for it because that really isn't, cities couldn't stay on top of it. Developers, when they have a project, they do the market study at that exact moment in time. Cities, if they have an economic development department, sometimes they will do market studies to see what kind of, they call it leakage, basically, who's going to Birmingham to buy this or that. And so anytime you do that, it's a snapshot at this exact moment. So nobody could have known in January of 2020 that our entire retail and service sectors were going to shut down for a year. And so because it's such a brief glimpse, it really doesn't help cities deal with things like their capital improvement budgets and stuff like that, that they have an economic and fiduciary responsibility for.
Sure.
That does happen though. In Auburn, they did a moratorium on building for apartments because developers were coming in with building apartments and then apartment buildings were sitting empty. And so that does happen. So have to do the moratorium
Sure.
on building apartments because developers, I mean, they don't just look at food because people come and live in either nicer, fancier apartments and leave that open.
Okay, everybody, public hearing next week, 6 o'clock in that room right there. Thanks, everybody, so much for your time tonight.
Make a motion.
Oh,
Yeah,
thank
yeah,
you.
yeah, send it out.
Sorry.
I will make a motion to send it out without recommendation in the public hearing.
Okay. Council Sims came in first. Me too.
Okay, second.
Yeah, okay. I got a motion from Council Sims, second from Council Gualdi. All those in favor? Sims. All those in favor? Aye. Andrew, in favor of sending out that recommendation? Aye.
Joe?
Any opposed?
Did you vote yes or no?
Yes. Okay.
You have a
5-0.
voice, you can actually say
That
yes
passes.
or no.
Okay. All right, Mr. Smith, you're up. 130221,
Surprised you didn't
request
get
for
it, Bill.
consideration of changes to the landscaping and tree requirements. Councilors Walton and Andrews.
Yes, here it is.
Got Andrew.
I didn't receive any comments. I received comments from a couple of folks, Amy Mile, and a few other folks.
Okay.
You did bring in a few comments.
Okay.
But they weren't earth shattering.
Okay.
Take those out. I think it's,
Okay. Hey, Alex. Alex,
Yes, ma'am.
we need to send this to council to send to planning commission. Am I right?
Correct. You need to send it out to council and council will send it to planning.
Okay. Is there a recommendation or no?
You can send it out with a recommendation to send it to planning commission.
Okay. Okay. Fine. Thank you.
Request to send to council, request to send to planning commission.
It's going to go to council for council to send to planning commission. So does anyone want to discuss or?
Just a quick question.
Sure.
I mean, is it still in here about permit on site or did that get out?
No.
I don't remember ever seeing that.
Okay.
What did you say after?
In one of the iterations of this ordinance, we added a provision to display the permit on site so that anyone walking by can see that.
Carlos.
And I do not see it in
Carlos.
this iteration.
We can certainly add.
Sorry.
We typically, whenever somebody comes in for a permit, they typically post that. So it would make sense for somebody to get a tree permit for the
I like that.
And we
Yeah, I love
discussed
that.
it, I just,
Yeah, it is in
maybe
here.
I'm missing it, but I don't see it.
Is it not in here?
I don't know. I don't remember seeing it. And this is the first.
I really
time.
like that. I'd like to add that. Make sure we add that. Yeah. Okay, Alex.
And maybe it's here, and I'm just
Still have
I'm just
agenda
giving
items
out,
to work
but I
through.
just wanted to make it known to add it if it's not there before it goes to the planning commission, because the whole point of sending it to the planning commission is that hopefully it's final by the time it gets.
Yes, I agree. I would like to just approve it and move it back out. So, yeah.
You know, I'm
Before
sorry, I
Saturday
didn't
night.
notice that until I just.
No, I'm
looking
glad
at
you
it
did.
tonight, so. And you're gonna come back tomorrow and tell me if it's probably, so I just couldn't put my finger on it. Thanks.
It was not, it's certainly added.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Okay. Anything else to leave? We would lose Andrew. Andrew, anything else? Okay. Somebody want, so I guess the motion then would be to approve it with the addition of the permit displayed in the council. Is that right?
Well, wouldn't we be just approving the changes in the document to go to council and then refer to the planning commission? Right? I mean, do we need to tag what we're adding on to the ordinance to what's going on there, or does he just send a markup copy to the planning commission with our changes? Not particularly you.
I don't know, Mike.
Okay, well, I'll make a motion to send this to council with the addition of language relating to the display of the tree permit on site. As per the language that Kale presents, and then we vote at council to send it to planning commission. That's, yeah.
Okay.
The language.
Yeah, one quick clarification.
Okay. All right.
So if somebody's already torn down the house, where are they gonna present their?
They can stake it. They can stake it.
Temporary power pole.
Okay, was that a motion?
Second.
A lengthy one.
Yeah. Okay, motion from Sims, second from Gwaltney. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? That's about 5-0. Wow, that's off my agenda then. Wow.
It'll be back.
Okay, with that, we are adjourned. Man, my